This is the Fujifilm GFX100S. It's Fujifilm's 102 megapixel medium format camera. Now, I've been using Fujifilm's smaller X system for about 7 years now. Now, I've used some of the GFXs before. I used the 50S when it first came out and the 50R, and I really do like them. But I've always gone back to using the X system. But I have to admit, I was really curious about what to expect from a 102 megapixel medium format camera. So in this video, I want to give my thoughts on it. I've been using it for a couple of weeks now as a landscape photographer, what you can expect from it and what you can expect from the system as a whole. When it comes to build quality, it is absolutely first class. It does remind me a lot of the DSLRs that I used to use, cameras like the D3 and the D800. It actually has a very similar feel and heft to something like the D800. It feels really tough. It feels like it's built to last. And it is weather sealed, which is the kind of minimum that you can expect from a camera like this. I've been using Fuji cameras for quite a while now. I've never really had any problem with the build quality. I do feel that their weather sealing and the build quality on their cameras is excellent. I've never had one break down on me or fail. The only one I ever broke was when I dropped it on a rock. So they are pretty tough, and this camera really does feel like you can take it out and use it in the elements, like you can abuse it a little bit, and it's still going to be fine. The doors over the sockets, the card slots and the battery do feel like a bit of a step up from a camera like the X-T4. It does feel really solid, and you do feel that there is quite a bit of quality here. Now, there's no denying that this is a big, heavy camera. I moved away from heavy DSLRs to the X system because I wanted to travel smaller and lighter. So for me, I really did notice the weight of this when I first started using it. I do a lot of hiking. I walk quite a long way to get my shots. So this, combined with the lenses, which are also quite a bit heavier, was something that I did notice. So 900 grams, it is lighter than the 50S, but it's also a little bit heavier than the 50R. But unlike those two cameras, it does have image stabilization in it. Now, it's also significantly lighter than the GFX100, which is quite impressive, really, because it's pretty much got all of the same feature set, the same sensor, the same image making capacity, and the same image stabilization that camera does have. But I did find that the biggest change in weight really comes from the lenses that you're going to have to carry with this system. There's just no way around that. The lenses are significantly bigger and heavier for medium format cameras. They've got to have much more glass to cover the much larger sensor area. So something like this is the 100 to 200, weighs significantly more than its equivalent on something like the X system, despite the fact that it has a less of a focal range than something like the 50 to 140 or the 55 to 200, or this is the 35 to 70. It's a mid-range zoom. It's the lightest zoom lens that Fuji make for the GFX system, and it is quite lightweight. It really doesn't feel like it has a lot of weight, but again, it's still significantly heavier than something like the 18 to 55. It's a much better quality than that, but it doesn't have anything like the same focal range. But having said all that, it is something that you get used to. It's perfectly manageable. After carrying this around for a few days, you kind of forget about it. It's just something that you deal with. It's just how heavy your pack is, and you just make allowances in other areas. Now, I'm going to be taking this with me to Namibia later this month, and that's not really a heavy-duty trekking kind of trip, but in July, I'm going to be doing Lofoten. We're going to be hiking up to a lot of the mountains there, and I'll be taking this along with me then. Now, it is going to affect, I suspect, some of the lens choices that I make, but I really don't see the weight being that much of a problem, but I'll know more probably after that trip as to whether it's manageable as a hiking camera. But even so, I don't think this is the kind of camera that I would want to take with me if I'm doing multi-day treks with a tent and all my sleeping gear and food and things like that. It's just too heavy. It takes up too much space. So for that kind of thing, I think you are going to be much better off with something like the smaller X system. Now, when it comes to the handling and controls, this camera is much similar to things like the XS10 and the XH2S in the fact that it's kind of moving away from Fuji's retro analog style where you've got all of the dials, the shutter dial, the ISO dial, the exposure compensation dial, all external on the camera. It's a lot more kind of sleek than that. The only dial here that you've got is this one at the end, which is basically the typical PSAM dial, and then everything else is done via buttons and basically wheels at the front and back. Now, I do find for me personally, while it's not as attractive as that kind of retro style of something like the X-T2, it does work really well. It is very intuitive to use. I tend to do all of my shooting in manual mode. So with the shutter control on the back and at the front, with a lens like this, where there's no aperture ring on the lens barrel itself, then you control the aperture with this dial at the front. You click it and then you can control the ISO, click it again, control the aperture. Now that works really well. It's very easy and intuitive to operate with the camera up against your eye. Now the rest of the camera in terms of the controls, it's actually relatively minimalist. There's not a lot sticking out. There's not a lot of buttons and controls, and everything does fall quite nicely underneath the hand. You've got the exposure compensation dial up here in the top, right next to the shutter button. You've got the focus mode here selected, usually on the front on a lot of cameras, but here it's on the back, which works quite well, next to the back focus button. The joystick here for operating the menu and for moving the focus, point is quite easy. Again, falls naturally under the thumb. And one thing that I do like is that it has a dedicated still photography mode, and then you switch this switch over here and it goes into dedicated video mode. Likewise, depending on which mode you're in, it's got dedicated menus for still photography or for video. It's the same as the X-T4. It's something that I really like. I do like to have those two aspects of the camera completely separated. I find it makes shooting both still photography and shooting video a lot more intuitive. Now the button placement on the back mostly makes sense. You've got the drive mode here, which I use a lot because I often go into bracketing, things like that. But I didn't like having the review button at the bottom here. This is where the display button is on quite a few Fuji cameras. I tend to use the display button a lot because I'm quite often turning off all of the information because I want to just see what the sensor's seeing without all of the shooting information on the top. And I find myself, my muscle memory hasn't quite worked yet, so quite often when I want to be playing around with the display, I'm going into review photos mode, and it seems strange to me to have the review mode down here and the delete button up here. Those two kind of feel like they should be next to each other, but that's just, I think, a matter of me getting my muscle memory and working my way around the camera. I do find that I really like the LCD on the top. Now this replaces things like the shutter dial and the exposure compensation dial on something like the X-T4. As I said, they're now controlled purely through these dials here, but I do really like this. I tend to have the camera a lot on a tripod, so I'm often looking down on it, and it's really nice to have all of the shooting information on an LCD on the top and just have the rear LCD just really clear so I can focus on composing for that. You can press this button here and it will cycle through different views. You've got these virtual dials, which is quite a nice touch, and then you've also got a live histogram, which is where I tend to leave it. It's something that I find really useful and I use a lot. Now the grips are really nice, really deep. It feels really secure in your hand, particularly with this sticky out thumb rest here. I must admit, with the bigger lenses like the 100 to 200, you do start to really feel it pull back. It strains the muscles here when you're holding it in your hands for any length of time. It reminds me of a lot of when I was a wedding photographer and I used to use something like the D3 with the 70 to 200. You really do feel the weight of it pulling you. It's a lot heavier. It does feel a lot heavier than something like the X system, but the grip is good. It really does feel secure in your hand. You never feel like you're going to drop it. You always feel like you've got a really good grip, and it's still very easy to operate and manipulate all the controls. Now the screen on the back is a return to the articulating screen that you get on a camera like the X-T3, and I must admit I do really like this. You can tilt it up, you can also tilt it down. It tilts this way if you're shooting in vertical mode. And I do, from a photography point of view, much prefer a screen like this to the flip around screen on something like the X-T4 or XS10. Although I do admit that those screens are really useful if you're shooting video. I'm using one now on the XS10, but this isn't really a camera that I think Fuji think many people are going to buy just to shoot video with. So this articulating screen really is a welcome return. Now in terms of the size of the screen, it's slightly bigger at 3.2 inches than the X-T4, and it does have a significantly higher resolution at 2.36 million dots, which is the same again as something like the GFX100. The EVF, however, is the same as the X-T4 at half an inch across and 3.69 million dots, so it has the same resolution, which is less than the resolution on the GFX100, which is 5.76 million. Now I do think that the EVF and the LCD are very good. They're big and bright and easy to use. But I have to say that with the screen in particular, I do wish it was a higher resolution. You don't really notice the resolution that you're getting from the sensor when you're looking at the images in the EVF, and particularly on the LCD, because the resolution isn't that much different to a camera like the X-T4. Now, one thing that is worth pointing out to landscape photographers, particularly people like myself who find themselves shooting the ocean a lot, is the remote control socket has been moved back to where it is on the X-T3. It's on the right side of the camera. It's here, which is something I really do appreciate. On a lot of cameras, when they put the remote socket on this side of the camera, that's where an L bracket fits. So when you've got the camera in vertical and the L bracket on your camera, you can't get to the remote control socket. So having it on this side of the camera really does make a difference. So from a landscape photography point of view, I'm really glad they've done that. It's a small thing, but it does make me happy. Now, with such a large sensor and so much resolution, you're going to expect to have really good image quality. But in real practical terms, what does that bigger sensor and all that resolution give you? Now, for me, resolution has relevance in two particular areas. That's in terms of printing and in terms of cropping. So even though this camera, 100 megapixels, is double the resolution of something like the 50S, it doesn't give you double the printing size. Along the longest edge, this has something like 11,600 pixels compared with about 8,200 pixels in a 50 megapixel camera. So you're getting about 3,000 pixels more. Now, in terms of printing, you're generally going to be printing at around 250 dpi or about 100 pixels per centimeter. So 11,200 pixels is going to give you native prints of 1.1 meters. Now that's really, really big. A 50 megapixel camera is going to give you about 80 centimeters. So you're getting about prints that are about 30% longer. Now, being able to print images natively from the camera of bigger than 1 meter without having to up-res or upscale them in Photoshop is perfect for me. That's the largest size print that I need. So that's really, really excellent. But then when it comes to cropping, now generally I don't like to crop that much when I'm using a camera. If you're cropping, you're just throwing away resolution. So it's always much better to try to get the image framed as perfectly as possible actually in camera. But what I find with the X system is that I am limited due to a lack of reach in the telephoto range. Now, I use telephoto shots a lot for my landscape photography. I tend to use the 55 to 200, which in full frame equivalence is something like 80 to 300. The 100 to 200 in full frame equivalent is about 180. That's at its longest end. So I do lose a lot of reach to what I'm used to shooting in my landscape photography. So the way that I can get around that is by cropping into the image. Now, because you've got so much resolution, you can crop really deeply into the image. If you crop almost halfway into the frame, it's still going to give you an image that's about 6,000 pixels along the longest edge, which is about 26 megapixels, the same as something like the X-T4. So you can crop quite deeply into it, but I would prefer not to have to. I do wish that Fuji made longer lenses for the GFX system. All right, so let's have a look at a few images. Now, this isn't ideal because obviously what you're going to be looking at has gone through video compression and YouTube compression, but it's just to give you a small idea of what you can expect from the raw files. So this is a raw file straight out of the camera taken with the 100 to 200 at about 115 millimeters. So let's just zoom in, and obviously with 100 megapixels, you've just got a huge amount of detail in there. You can see wherever you look in the image, there's just so much detail. We can zoom in just a little bit further. If we go to 200%, obviously we're going past the native pixel size, but just the amount of detail back there, we can see just, I think over here, there's a bird. If we zoom out, again, you get an idea of just how much detail that's resolving, and these vehicles over here. So the camera really does pick up an astonishing amount of detail. Down here in the foreground, if we look at these trees a little bit closer, every single leaf there is pretty much visible, and we were quite a long way from this. We're about 1 kilometer away from this road. So it really is, you're going to get a huge amount of detail from these files. Now, the native ratio in the camera is 4:3, which is something that I find myself really liking. I think it's a really natural format. The 3:2 in that you get in the X system and in most cameras, it's nice, but I don't like it that much when I'm shooting vertically. It feels just a little bit long and stretched. So I do really like the 4:3 ratio. You can obviously crop if you want to shoot in a different ratio. Now the camera does allow you to crop in camera. So what it will do is if you want to shoot square format, or if you want to shoot 16:9, which is a format that I particularly like, what it will do is blank out the viewfinder so you can compose in that panoramic or in the 1:1 format. And you will get a JPEG that is cropped, but it will always give you a raw file that is the full 4:3. So the bit that's cropped out will still be showing in the raw file. So you'll have to crop it again in post. But it does help in terms of composition. And if you change your mind later on, then you do get the full resolution, because obviously if you're shooting 16:9 or 1:1 or 2:3, it's going to be cropping off some pixels in the frame. So you will be losing some of the resolution. Now this file here, it's cropped and it's been edited, and I just wanted to show it just to give you some idea of what a processed file looks like. Now again, we're looking at 200% here, which is zooming in deeper. So just what I really do love about this camera is the way that it interacts with light. It really does bring out, there's a depth and quality to the light, there's a depth and quality to the color, to the shadow. I'm really not quite sure what that is. I don't know if it's just to do with the resolution or if it's to do with the bigger pixels on the medium format sensor, but it really does have absolutely lovely color reproduction and reproduction of light. The images really just pop, and I found that it didn't have to do much work to them at all in Lightroom in processing to really bring out the best from them. Now this next image, I just picked this one just to give you an idea of what you can expect in terms of shadows and highlights. So if we flip over to the develop panel here, this was part of a bracketing sequence that I shot at different exposures. Let's just pull out the shadows just to see how much you can bring out there. So you can see even in the deepest shadows, that's what it looks like. That's what was recorded. That's what it looks like. There is just a huge amount of detail. Looking at 100%, you really can't see any degradation of the image quality, even though I've pushed the highlight slider all the way across to 100%. There's a tiny little bit of noise showing, but again, this is zoomed into 100%. It's almost not visible at all. Now this file brings me to something else that you're going to notice if you've been shooting a lot with full frame, or even more so with APS-C, is that the bigger sensor has less depth of field. So this is an image when we move up, you can see already the field of focus. It's out of focus as soon as we get a few meters into the image, and the farmhouse in the back is out of focus. So this is also part of a focus stacked image. Now, if I was shooting with an APS-C format, I almost certainly would be able to do this probably in one frame. These flowers in the front here, they're not that close to the camera. This is shot with the 35-70 at 38 millimeters. And these are a couple of meters away, I think, certainly at least 1.5 meters. So the flowers in the front are in focus and pin sharp. And again, you can see the amount of detail there, the dew on the morning dew on that leaf. But you do start to lose the focus pretty quickly. It is something to be aware. You do need to focus stack a lot more shooting medium format wide angle than you do if you're shooting APS-C or even full frame. Now this is shot right into the sun here. This is the rising sun, so the sun's right in the frame, and of course no matter how good the dynamic range is on any camera, that's always going to be blown out there. There's no way of controlling those highlights. But what I just found remarkable about this camera is how smooth the highlight roll-off is. There's just no banding whatsoever as you go from the clipped highlights across into the part of the frame that's properly exposed. Just the tonal variations are incredible. It handles light so well. And this final image, this is actually a cropped really deep into an image. Just to give you an idea here, this is just 3000 by 2000 pixels. So this is a 6 megapixel image. So I've cropped out a huge amount of data because I really wanted to photograph this tree. I just didn't have the reach. I'd have needed something like a 500 millimeter or even longer just to be able to isolate this tree. What I did was I just cropped it down and give myself a frame that is literally it's just 3000 pixels long, so it's really cropped in quite deep. But even so, when you zoom in, this has so much more quality than you would expect from a regular 6 megapixel image. It looks fantastic. And as I say, this is cropped so deep in that I'm losing, if it's just 6 megapixels, then I'm cropping out something like 95 megapixels of the image, which is, yeah, so it's 95% of the resolution is gone, and yet you're still left with a usable frame that is printable up to something like 30 centimeters or about 12 inches along the longest edge of the frame. So overall then, as you'd expect, the image quality is outstanding. The resolution gives you just a huge amount of detail, which allows you to print really large or to crop really deep into images. And the larger sensor just gives wonderful color and highlight roll off. It gives real vibrancy to the colors and just an incredible amount of detail that you can pull out of things like the shadows. The dynamic range really is impressive. Now, I don't think anyone buys a camera like this for its video capabilities, but it is relatively capable. It does shoot 4K, it does shoot in f-log, which is really useful for grading your footage. However, it doesn't shoot 60 frames per second. It maxes out at 30 frames per second. But in comparison with something like the 50R, which only shot full HD, it didn't shoot log, you were limited to the film simulations. This is a quite useful video camera, and I certainly used it a lot for shooting little bits of B-roll. So it's not essential, but it is useful, and it's something that's nice to have. Fuji have really upped their game when it comes to image stabilization, and scaling down the mechanism to stabilize a big sensor like this from the huge camera like the GFX100 to a much smaller body like this is actually pretty impressive. And Fuji are claiming this has 6 stops of stabilization, which actually makes it slightly better than its bigger brother. Now, what does that mean in real terms? So a general rule for shooting is that your shutter speed should always be twice as long as your focal length to avoid shake. So if you're shooting at 100 millimeter, you should be shooting at something like 1/200. Now 6 stops means that you should be able to shoot at 1/3, at 1/3 of a second, which I tried, and you can see the results here. This is with stabilization on, and this is what it looks like with the stabilization turned off. And when it comes to video, this is shot at 200 millimeter. This is without image stabilization, and this is with the stabilization turned on. So you can see that shooting handheld, the image stabilization really does make a difference. Now, when it comes to battery life, this uses the same batteries that you find in the X-T4, which is really nice because if you have both cameras, it means you can use the same batteries. You don't need to go out and buy loads of batteries. Now in the X-T4, where it's giving you about 600 shots from one charge of the battery, Fuji claiming here this gives you something more like 400 shots, which is relatively good. I mean, it's not brilliant. I wish it were better, but I found that I could easily get through a session with just one battery, and usually through a whole day without having to change battery. So for someone like me, if I've got 3 batteries, that means I can always have one charging, and I've basically got 2 batteries in the field, and that's enough for the kind of shooting that I do. Now, while I know this is a review of the camera, I don't really think you can review this camera with a look into what it feels like to use it without talking about the system as a whole. Now, it's been about 5 years now since Fuji first introduced the GFX system. But Fuji are a relatively small company. They don't have the manufacturing capacity of a company like Sony or a company like Canon. And what we seem to be getting with the GFX system is something like 2 new lenses each year. So it's a relatively small system, and it does have its limitations. So if you really need fast primes, Fuji don't really make many fast primes. And when it comes to the zooms that I need for landscape photography, I've already said that I really do need something a little bit longer than the 100 to 200. But the only thing that Fuji have got longer than that is a prime that's 250. So you get the extra reach, but you lose the flexibility of the zoom. And I'd need to have extra lenses to cover the focal lengths that I'm losing. Now, when it comes to wide angle, which is particularly useful to me as a landscape photographer, you're limited to the 23mm prime, which isn't particularly wide, and you don't have the flexibility of a zoom. Fuji have announced the 20 to 35. I'm really interested in using that lens, and I'll be getting it as soon as it comes out. I was hoping it would be out for the trips that I'm going to make this summer, but that's not the case. What I have been using is the 35 to 70. Now, this is what Fuji kind of call the kit lens for the GFX system. It was launched with the 50S Mark II. And it is nice. It's a sharp lens. It's light and small as you can expect a medium format lens to make. But I don't really always understand Fujifilm's priorities when it comes to the choices of the focal lengths that they're going to make, because this has almost the exact same focal range as the 32 to 64. And very recently Fuji announced and launched the 45 to 100. So we have three kind of medium range, mid-range zooms which cover a similar focal length, but we don't have a particularly long telephoto and we don't have the ultra-wide zoom yet. Now you can make a case for all of those mid-range zooms. They're all good and they're all useful in their own particular way. But Fuji's prioritization of when they're putting out the zooms is not always particularly clear to me. However, when we do get that 20 to 35, I do think that there's a relatively good range here. You can, with three lenses, you can have quite a decent focal range, but I do still wish there was something a little bit longer at the telephoto end. Now, given Fuji's history with film medium format cameras, classic cameras like the 690, the 645, or the 617 Pano camera, it's kind of a logical step for Fuji to make a digital medium format camera. Now, after the success of their X system, which is APS-C, there was a lot of clamoring for Fuji, are you going to move into the full frame market? But again, it makes sense for a smaller camera manufacturer like Fuji to kind of jump over that and go into the medium format market where they're competing in a much more niche market rather than competing in the full frame market, which is saturated with really good cameras from people like Canon and Nikon and Sony, who have really, really mature and large lens lineups. So it's kind of a logical thing for Fuji to do. It does make a lot of sense, but you can't deny that they are expensive cameras. There's no way around the fact that this is an expensive system to start using. However, I do remember not that long ago when a medium format digital camera would cost you about the same price as a small car. I also remember when I started with digital photography that the camera that all landscape photographers aspire to was the Canon 1DS Mark II, which was full frame and had a 16 megapixel sensor and cost something like about $9,000. So while this is an expensive camera, for something that's right at the very high end of imagery production, it's really not that unreasonably priced. But before you switch to a system like this, you do need to be fully aware of the limitations of what this is and what this isn't. You don't get the same kind of lens lineup that you'll get in a lot of full frame systems. We've got the lens limitations that I've already talked about earlier in the video. And also it brings into issue the small things, like someone like me. I always like to have a backup body. I go into some quite remote places. I'm experiencing some quite harsh weather. So I like to have a second body with me. Taking two GFX bodies really does massively increase the weight. But then if you're taking a smaller camera body, something like the X system, you have to have two separate lens systems, which leads to all kinds of different problems and decisions about which lenses you're going to take for which camera system. Now, these are definitely not deal breakers. They're not insurmountable problems, but there are things to be aware of. And you should ask yourself before you buy a camera like this is whether you need what this camera can offer you. If you're shooting a lot and printing really large, then absolutely this is a fantastic image making tool. The images it produces are absolutely wonderful. There's a depth and a quality and a richness to the files that comes out wonderfully in print. And it's just really tough. It's really well made. It's super functional, and I just find it really intuitive and pleasant to use in the field. It gets out of the way like all good cameras do and just allows me to focus on making images and capturing the mood of scenes, which is really, for me, what landscape photography is all about. And I think that's it for this review. If there's anything that I've missed, if there's anything that you'd like to know, just drop me a comment or drop me an email and I'll get back to you. Now, I'm going to be heading to Namibia at the end of this week, taking this with me. I'm going to be going to Lofoten and then Iceland, and then I'll be in the Dolomites on workshops. Now, if you'd like to come with me on a workshop for next year, I'll be heading back to Namibia. I'll be heading to Greenland. I'll be heading to Iceland. So check out my website. There's all of my trips. All the trips that I'm doing are on there. And if there's anything that you're interested in, anything that you'd like to join me on, just drop me a line. And as ever, thanks for watching. Thanks for supporting the channel. Good luck with all your photography and take care. See ya.